Welcome back to another episode of Know Your Legacy. I'm your host, V, and today's guest is David Burkus. David is a best-selling author, keynote speaker, and the professor of leadership and innovation at Oral Roberts University. His most recent book, Friend of a Friend, talks about the science of networking and how we can all become better connected. But he's also wrote on the topic of creativity and innovation and business management. David, thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
No, most definitely, man. So I think some of the stuff that you've been writing on has been really interesting, especially the Friend of a Friend, which is the most recent book. But before we get into, I guess, the science of networking and dealing with people and connecting and things of that nature, how do you become a professor of leadership and innovation? How do you get that title?
So that part of my life is actually completely accidental. So I knew I wanted to be a writer in some capacity from probably 14, maybe 16 years old, somewhere in there. When you're a teenager, you pretty much only know fiction, right? So I was running around between trying to catch up on people like Hemingway and Steinbeck, and then reading kind of current literary fiction authors. That was kind of my vein that I thought I was going to be in. So I went to university to study English and creative writing. And while I was in university as an undergrad is when I read Malcolm Gladwell's The Tipping Point came out while I was in there. I think a couple other books in that, what I'm going to call the social science writer space, that Gladwell really sort of broke open, but very quickly the Heath brothers swooped in, Daniel Pink, those type of authors. And so I'm like a third year, fourth year in undergrad going, wow, this is fascinating, right? So essentially got a job, but then also immediately went back to graduate school and did grad school got a master's in organizational psychology part-time. The idea was so that I would understand the science so that I could write about it, right? Like, this is my grand plan in my head. And then largely because I ended up marrying a med student, after I finished my master's, I got bored. Because we had basically established this regular occurrence of study dates. They were the only type of dates we ever went on because she was always studying and I was doing grad school for that. So I enrolled in a doctoral program. I just leveled it up, right? Let me study even more. And around that time, I was also sort of working on the platform element, right? I had started a podcast. I started like a blog/newsletter that did a lot of curated content. The whole idea was just to have something that I could then launch a book into, right? And around that time, through various different connections, I actually got a call from my alma mater where I went to undergrad and university, and basically said, this person kind of surprised us with retirement. We know you have the doctoral degrees, we know you're fit, we've been, I'm still living in the same city, so I knew a lot of those people. Would you come on campus and talk about adjunct teaching for us? And I was kind of like, sure, whatever, we'll see. So I was teaching at night some of the kind of working adult and MBA program classes. And then that basically turned into a full-time offer. And I was like, well, this is a way better career to launch books and that sort of stuff from than what I was doing at the time. So I was like, sure, let's do it, right? I mean, that was literally it. I mean, there were a couple interview processes. It wasn't just like they handed me the offer. But I was open to that idea because it seemed like an easier path to get to where I am now as a writer and speaker and what have you. And so that's why. It was completely accidental. My original grand plan of life was to just keep doing the other thing until I had a large enough platform and had written a book and could just quit my job and go be a writer thing. This has been a much easier transition, but totally accidental. Yeah.
It's crazy. It's crazy. That's why I wanted to ask you, because everyone's story is different, but it's crazy how you start off with wanting to do one thing and then you ultimately end up doing it, but from a completely different way that you never thought would happen. And I recently spoke to, we had on the show, Lillian Garcia. I don't know if you know her from the WWE. She was a famous ring announcer for 15 years there. And she wanted to do acting and singing. And then she got a random audition with the WWE and she was like, this isn't something I planned. But through that, she ended up being able to sing and act and travel the world and all of those things. Yeah. And we were just talking about a similar journey where you want to start doing one thing and then the opportunity is disguised in a completely different way, but it's still an opportunity for the thing that you wanted to do. So it's great that you are open to it.
Now I feel bad because I didn't know her, because watch this, right? So when I was younger, I was a huge WWE fan.
Oh, wow. Right? I got to connect you guys then, because she's just...
Right.
She just moved
I
over
was
to
like Bret the Hitman Hart era, right? Shawn Michaels, The Undertaker, sort of. I guess The Undertaker still hasn't retired yet.
yeah.
All of those guys are retired. Like I haven't paid attention to wrestling since like the mid '90s.
Yeah,
But
yeah, no,
yeah, so I feel bad. I should know who she is, but I guess she didn't start announcing until I had, become a teenager and stopped watching wrestling.
yeah, she I think last week she recently moved into the PFL, so the Professional Fighters League. So she's announcing
Oh, cool.
MMA now. Yeah, it's crazy. So yeah, I'll connect you guys up afterwards.
Well, so ironically, that's what these ones are. These are belts from jiu-jitsu, right? So
yeah.
that was also when I was younger and more able to compete. But yeah, those I actually earned. This one I just bought on the internet.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's amazing, man. So, just looking back then, so was English something that you like were always fond of, like reading, and so you always knew that okay, I want to write, I want to express in that form.
So pretty much. I mean, I was sort of lucky. We always joke that I have two other siblings, and we always joke that we all sort of had creative interests, but all in different fields, so we weren't competitive. My sister was very big into theater, my brother into music, and then mine ended up being writing. What's interesting is that all three of us, I actually have no idea what their like SAT scores and things like that were, but all three of us, I think, I know for a fact that I did, scored higher on quantitative, right? So like we were better over on the math side, and but that was always sort of been that sort of passion. So yes, to that extent. I mean, I actually the other day, maybe not the other day now, it's probably 6 months ago or so, was flipping through this big chest of like junk that your parents save, right, from when you're a kid and you don't really care. And apparently in like second grade, I had like handwritten and self-published a book and was like super proud of myself around. So apparently the seed was planted way back further. I usually look at those kind of teen years. I was heavily involved in like running the like school newspaper. We had a literary magazine too that I was the editor of. It was very much that. It was some cool experiences. I grew up in New England in the Northeast, and like there are all sorts of young writers conferences there. I actually got to meet and traded a few emails until I made the mistake of not doing this. I got to meet Dan Brown, and I was like the only kid that came up afterwards. Dan Brown from the Da Vinci Code and Angels and Demons and all that. And I was the only kid that came up to him afterwards and asked him for like his email if I could send him a few more questions. And he was not famous at this point, so he was like, "Sure." And we traded emails for probably 9 months to a year. While he wrote 3 books before the Da Vinci Code took off. And so it was like that era. But somewhere in here, I still have a copy of like his first book, which is also his worst, signed from him that he sent to me. So it was easy to find encouragement too. So it wasn't just sort of a passion. I was lucky to be in an area where it was really easy to find encouragement in that world. None of that led to writing nonfiction books, right? That kind of big light bulb moment happened later, but for sure it was always there.
So as you were going through studying, so you were doing English, I think you said you were doing English, and then you went through all of that sort of stuff. At which point did you then realize, okay, I want to start writing? Because you initially started writing on creativity and innovation, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, I mean, even so, until I was probably 20 years old, nonfiction wasn't even on my radar, right? And some of this is like just being a dumb kid. Like when you're a teenager, the only nonfiction books you ever read are textbooks, right? So, no, that sounds boring. I don't want to do that, right? You read for entertainment, or even in English classes, et cetera, you're reading fiction, right? So it wasn't, I was 20 years old and I used Gladwell. Gladwell may not have even been the first one. He's just the one I remember. When I read like a nonfiction book and remember being like, oh my gosh, this person is a brilliant storyteller, but they're writing nonfiction content that's actually like helpful to people as opposed to just being entertaining. It had never occurred to me until 2 decades into my life that like you could do that. And then you start, so that was fascinating. And then to be honest, you start doing the research and you start to get a little shrewd and you realize that like those people have a better chance of being able to eat than the people who are trying to write novels all of the time, right? So some of it was also that, like, maybe this is a better path forward quality of life-wise, but it was also that idea that, like, the combination of using good storytelling to explain a principle, but then diving into the science behind the principle was really, really fascinating. That led to the first book, which is around creativity, largely because So the unifying thing, where I sort of found a voice per se, the unifying thing is that all of my books are trying to tear down misconceived notions that we have, tear down those myths, which is an outright term we use in the creativity book, but tear down those things that are common sense but actually wrong, right? And especially when you're younger, it's really easy. It's hard to do a leadership type book. It's really easy to target creativity because people let you speak to that more. But it also was the one probably most mired in myths and misconceptions anyway. So that was sort of the reason we chose it. The podcast that I was running at the time, and the newsletter that we were circulating out, was actually all around kind of leadership topics, that it just seemed like a better path and a better received path to go after creativity first.
So during the process of writing and doing the research, what was the most surprising thing that you'd learned?
On the myths of creativity? Probably in that book was what we called the Mousetrap Myth. For that phrase, if you build a better mousetrap, the world will beat a path to your door, which ironically I thought was a more commonly known phrase when I decided to term it that chapter. Often people are like, why did you choose it mousetrap? Like, you've never heard that. Okay, I guess I was wrong. I thought everybody had heard that phrase. But the idea is that we recognize great ideas sort of on their face, right? Like, that we recognize when we see an amazing new thing, we recognize it all the time. Not actually true, right? Not true in any domain. Like in business history is full of senior leaders of organizations not recognizing amazing products. Kodak invented the digital camera, didn't develop it. Xerox invented the personal computer, didn't invest in it. So Apple and Microsoft sort of stole their lunch, right? In music, Igor Stravinsky's famous Rite of Spring caused a riot on its opening night because people didn't like it that much. Even in modern examples, like Seinfeld, like people's greatest show ever. If you're over like 34, it's your favorite television show ever by so much of the world. It actually had terrible ratings for its first season. And it was the executives at the network that sort of were fans of it and begged their superiors to let it keep going. So very rarely do people recognize amazing ideas on their face. And there's research behind sort of why that is. But that was, I didn't see, until I saw the research, it didn't click with me that that's what's going on in all of these stories. We always tell them as great stories of perseverance. They're not. They're actually stories of really smart people who are really dumb when it comes to recognizing creative ideas. And we're all that way. We all suffer from that same bias.
That's interesting, because I don't know if you've read a book called Where Good Ideas Come From.
Yeah, Stephen Johnson.
Yeah, exactly. So the way he breaks it down is phenomenal, because he also talks about one thing which surprised me was having exposure to lots of different resources that you wouldn't normally have exposure to, so that you could build those neural connections. So I don't know if that was something that came across your...
Yeah, so we talked about it a bit in the book. I called it the Originality Myth. So we also have this idea that creative ideas are wholly original, as Johnson also sort of unpacks in his book, which ours came out, I think his came out about a year before mine. By the way, I'm a huge fan of Stephen Johnson. Like, both of my second and third books have either stories or cool quotes or something like that I never would have found if it weren't for Stephen. But I call it the Originality Myth, and it's this, we think that ideas are sort of these wholly original things that, quite frankly, that they're property of one person because only that person would have invented it. But the truth is, you read Johnson, simultaneous inventions happen more often than we're willing to admit. And fundamentally, all ideas are combinations of pre-existing ideas. And so it's the person who gathers the biggest set of raw material from the most diverse set of sources that has the best chance stumbling upon combinations that other people won't have discovered, right? Now, we as humans, right, we work the opposite way. We drill down. We go to school, where even in school, we narrow down what subjects you learn in public school or primary school. Then you go to college and you choose a major, so you focus in. If you go to grad school, there's no general ed curriculum in grad school. It's even more focused. And we just then you get a job and you keep getting better and better at that sort of same specialization. And what suffers from that is that awareness of what's going on in the rest of the world that we can borrow ideas from. And not only is it that ideas are combinations of pre-existing ideas, most of the time when an idea like enters an industry and totally disrupts it, it isn't actually all that original. It's just an idea that was borrowed from a different industry. Like everyone loves it in business. Everyone loves to talk about Netflix and Blockbuster and how Netflix just destroyed Blockbuster. Netflix was a subscription service, right? Like we've had magazines and newspapers for like 100 years. It's not an original idea. Figuring out how to mail DVDs is unique and original, but the actual business model is just, it's just from a different domain than movies. And then some brilliant Reed Hastings and other people moved it from the world of subscription over to there. You know, yes, it's disruptive, but it's not actually that original.
Yeah, no, you make complete sense because you're just building on the platform that others have built before you. And then it's the person who's able to, which I heard someone else say is remix good ideas together. Then you have the most likely chance of creating the next best thing or the new thing that breaks through the noise of all these, you know, startups and other ideas that have been thrown around every single day.
Yeah, there's a great, it's about a 25 minute short film by Kirby Ferguson called Everything is a Remix. That is well worth watching. And he's just free. Like he has a website on it where it's just free to watch it. And then if you want to like say thanks by tipping him and donating whatever, but it's a brilliant, brilliant film. I mean, we should put it in the show notes so people can click it.
Most definitely. I just made
I'm going to count on you to do that. Okay.
Yeah, I definitely will do. Yeah, I just made a note of it on my phone. I will do that. So that sounds interesting. But so where did the idea for the next book then come in? Because that's slightly different. That's more business management. So that's
super different, right?
Yeah, let's go more. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so the second book, I mean, it was a logical progression in the sense that we wrote Myths of Creativity. It came out there, and of course, the biggest target audience was the business world, but also the biggest questions that came from it were like, great, we know all of this stuff, but like, how do we do this? How do we implement this in our workplace? And so rather than get super prescriptive and be like, do this, because by the way, I'm also like 32 years old at this point. So I don't think that would go over all that well anyway. Rather than do all of that, I went out and like, all right, well, what do the most creative workplaces in the world do? Like, what do their policies and procedures look like? And some of them are very, very different, right? They don't have just a manager and maybe like the manager and her boss hire people. They hire as this huge team. They don't even really pay that much attention to the org chart. They care more about letting people cross-pollinate and cross boundary lines and that sort of stuff. Like a great example, we look at like a company like Google, and we think that the free food is actually just about workplace perks and making people fat and happy. It's not true. You go to any restaurant in pretty much any location that Google has an office, you will see that all of the tables have at least 4 seats. The idea is that you are going to sit down at a long table with people you don't normally work with, and those conversations will let people cross-pollinate ideas, right? So each of the practices, there's like 11 different chapters in Underdo Management, and each of them are, here's what some companies are doing differently and why it works. And then here is the research behind why this might actually be better than what most of us are doing now. So in some ways it's very different. In others, it was kind of an attempt to answer that, like, okay, if we dispel the myths of creativity and we go for a more innovative workplace, what does it look like? Well, here's some examples of what that might look like.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking of Apple, because I was reading it I can't quite remember the name of the book. I'll try and get it for you afterwards. But they gave an example of Apple and how when they're coming up with a new idea, for example, the iPhone, they would then sit each person from a different department down at the same meeting, so that if there were any roadblocks, they'd be able to brainstorm how to get over it there and then, rather than having each department siloed, so that it bounces back from one department to the other, because one says, oh, it's not possible. And then the other one says, no, it has to be. And then when you go around in this circle, why don't just get everyone in a room so you can brainstorm ideas and go back and forth as to what's possible, what's not. And then you just come to the solution so much faster.
Right. And so in the book, I call this writing the org chart in pencil. The reason being, you're never going to like erase the org chart. In the early 90s, especially, there were all of these consulting firms that were running around telling organizations they had to be matrixed, right? And all that really happened was people had 6 different bosses and they were all miserable. And then different consulting firms made a ton of money taking people out of matrixed organizations. But so like the hierarchical org chart, that's probably not going anywhere. And in fact, it's actually really good from the standpoint of downward communication and also kind of keeping people accountable for performance, but you need to set up systems where you let people go across it. So that's why I call writing it in pencil. There are times where we want to erase it and rewrite, a reporting relationship somewhere else. That is a great example. Another one that I love that's in the book is the company IDEO does this thing they call giving time, where about 5% of your weekly schedule is donated to, actually, now that I think about it, it's in Friend of a Friend, it's not in Under New Management, is scheduled to volunteer for other teams. If you want to go sit on their focus group, or they've got a brainstorming session and you're from accounting, but you can go spend your 5% of giving time helping them out, and you won't be punished for it. That's, even though it's not your job, that's a great way to just sort of culturally reinforce this idea that we need ideas from everywhere and we benefit from that. And so we can't just let team be defined as who reports to whom on an org chart.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think you've given this example before of Pixar and how they have lots of different people from different departments bond over activities. Why would you say that works? Like, what's so interesting about that?
Yeah, okay, so now we've got to get into the question, in terms of Pixar, I wrote about it in Friend of a Friend with how they use the training and development department to give classes and stuff that you wouldn't be remotely useful, right, to a business. Like, you can take karate classes there, you can take improv acting classes, which is kind of helpful, especially for the creatives, but like, it's not going to help you do your day-to-day job that much better. One of the discoveries that they found is that it allows for people who are just interested in that to use the fact that they're interested in something non-work related to sign up for the class. And then you get people from various different departments who are all together on this. And we know from a decent amount of research that these activities, things where there's a different interest at play, draw people together from very diverse sets, and also encourage people to like drop their who are you and what do you do script. So they don't, in that hour-long class that day, they're not thinking about what their position in the company is, which unfortunately too many of us do, right? So there's a lot of well-meaning companies that will plan company picnic and we'll do a cocktail hour once a week. Or like, I mean, there's literally, I know of an organization, they recruit a lot of college students, that's why I know this. Like, it's company policy to go out for drinks every Thursday, and like the manager has to pay. And we think that will help a lot of these relationships. And it does to some extent with socialization, but people still stay in their bucket. They're still in their prescribed script role. They use that time to talk to the people that they normally talk to. It's only when you focus in their interest on something else that you get a diverse set of people who are actually dropping the script and focusing on what happens, and you build much more diverse connections than if you're just at those bland meeting times.
Yeah, no, definitely. And the reason I asked is because I guess through those conversations, naturally, organically through a conversation, you'd end up talking about work as well. And if you find that person is suitable for another role in the company, or you like the way that they think or act or behave, you might just want to call them to your department to say, oh, can you give your insight on this? Or you might be good to help me with this. And some crossing of ideas can happen that way, I guess.
Right. Work conversations are always going to go back to work. The difference is now you've let people build rapport and get to like and trust people from other departments. And so when the work conversation comes up, even if it's just sharing a problem that you're having, you're going to have listening ears that are very different from your function. And that's great from an innovative solution standpoint.
Yeah, most definitely. So where did the inspiration for the book actually come about? Was it your own frustration of growing your own network?
For Friend of a Friend?
Yeah.
It was a dissatisfaction with what the market had to offer. How's that? So the idea was in both Myths of Creativity and in Under New Management, we had drawn on some research from the world of network science, which I just find fascinating. The researchers like Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler and Duncan Watts, who did 6 Degrees of Separation, like the strength of weak ties study, all of these are like fascinating. And when it came to networks and networking, books sort of fell into two categories. Like, the first was the fascinating books by the actual researchers about their research, which are great, but they're kind of like, unless you regularly listen to NPR, they're a little esoteric and snooty, right? So they're fascinating, but they're not hitting a very wide audience. And then what is getting digested by the very wide audience is the advice books. I did it this way, and so you should do it this way too. Here's how to give an elevator pitch. Here's how to introduce two people. Those are all advice, and advice is very autobiographical, right? And so unless you are very similar to the person giving that advice, the likelihood that you're going to be able to apply it and have it work and also not feel inauthentic and sleazy is very, very little. And so I sort of saw there's a lot of dissatisfaction in the world when it comes to this topic, because a lot of people are trying to apply the advice and they're feeling inauthentic, they're feeling sleazy. And if they stumble into these fascination books, they're not sure how to take the next leap and kind of apply it. And so that was the grand idea was like, what if we had a book that combined the two, that was steeped in this research, but got very specific about, now that you understand the science of how networks work, here's what to do in terms of your own life. And I'm not going to give you a perfect script for introducing yourself. What I'm going to do is go, here's how to audit your network to see if you're not as diverse as you think, or here's why you should seek out those shared activities instead of a cocktail hour type of a thing, right? So willing to get prescriptive like the advice books, but it's not my advice. It's here's an application of all of this stuff over here.
So what would you say is the point of all that? Because people are thinking like, I'm fine without it. Like, why do I need to know that? What's the point of it?
Yeah, I mean, quite frankly, most people aren't, right? Most people are either in that category where they know they need to be networking, but it drives them nuts and they feel sleazy and weird, which is where I was too. Or even if they're doing it, most of us allow our networking efforts to be organic. And by organic, I mean just kind of like we're not deliberate about who we want to meet and why. We're just open to meeting lots of people. And the research is strongly indicative that that's a great posture, and it's better than not being open to meet new people. But if you're just trusting serendipity and the regular occurrences of the day to meet people, you're going to end up meeting people who are very, very self-similar. I mean, just yesterday, I was talking to a buddy of mine who was throwing this big event. He's looking for a lot of different voices to speak into it. And so he's going out to his network, and he calls me because he goes, my network is way too male and way too pale, right? And I'm trying to find a female leader. I'm trying to find a person of color to speak to this, and I don't even know them, right? And that's what happened. He's been in sales for like 30 years. If anybody thinks they're a good networker, he does. It's not until we realize we need that diversity of ideas, that diversity of experiences, that a lot of people who fancy themselves as good networkers run up against a network science principle known as homophily, which is that if you're just allowing introductions from other people to grow your network's going to be very self-similar. And so we have to be a little bit more deliberate. We have to audit. We have to treat our network the way a network scientist would if they were trying to analyze us. And then we know where to go forward.
So that's interesting. So then how would a network scientist approach it? Because most people, based on I think you call it the cognitive bias of likability, you just naturally get drawn to the people that you are similar to you, have same interests, same personality, that kind of thing. So your network ends up reflecting the people that you like or have similar interests too. So how do you come out of that?
Well, so there's two things at play when we look in the research. So number one is that, but it turns out that that's actually a really small percentage of how this uniformity in a network happens. The bigger point is what we were talking about, is just the way that it's compounded, because if you're a little bit more attracted to people who are self-similar to you, then you'll spend a tiny bit more percentage of time with them, and then that will compound. And it's much more likely that when they introduce you to somebody, that will be somebody who's self-similar, et cetera. I mean, it's 2019. Most people are not overtly trying to build a network that is only white men, right? And if you are, I can't help you at this. Like, if that's what you're looking for in life, you're wrong, and I don't know how to convince you of that at this point, because it's 2019. But most of us, we try, and then we stumble into this because we're not realizing that compounding effect. So, I mean, the first solution and the easiest solution is to do an audit of your network. Look at like the top 25 people that you interact with most frequently, and then see where they are on certain things. It might be ethnicity or gender. It might be kind of like political. It might be what function are they in organization? There's a lot of different variables. Whichever one you're interested in from a standpoint of am I too self-similar, look at that. Like, make a list of the people and then see where they are on each of those issues. And that'll do two things. One, you'll probably find that of the 25, you only have about 5 to 10 who are all that different, and the majority are similar to you. The second thing you'll find is now you know who the different ones are. So now you know to be deliberate about how much time you're spending with them to counteract that kind of small little natural bias. And so if you deliberately spend more time in in those circles, if you're deliberately spending more time with those people, if you're seeking out the activities that they're regularly drawn to, over time you sort of counteract those effects. But it only happens if you know who these people are and why you need to be with them much more often than you're with the people that make you feel comfortable.
So that was going to be my next thing, because if someone's listening right now and they're thinking, okay, that's great, I want to put the effort in to actually make that happen because I want to expand my circle, and I've gone through the top 20 or 25 people and they, you know, I enjoy speaking to them, but it's the same old, same old. What are the steps to take in terms of how to go about finding, you know, where you should meet these people?
Yeah, so you already have a few of them. You're gonna have a few of them. If all 25 are very, very similar to you, then like you're probably gonna have to go back to that unstructured meetings, trusting serendipity until you find a few. But most of us are gonna have a few, and now you know you need to spend more time with them. What systems you put into place to make sure of that is very, very different. Like one system that I encourage a lot of people to do, and it works kind of well, is what I call shortlist, longlist. Shortlist being, these are the smaller list of people that it is unforgivable for me to go 2 weeks without talking to, right? Or like, candidly, the way we came up with shortlist, longlist is that when my wife and I got married, we brought whole groups of friends to the table, and we realized that only a small list of them we actually cared about hanging out with as a couple and what have you. The long list is still people you like, but you can trust that like serendipity and the fact that you're already having similar interests and what have you are gonna let you get in touch with those people frequently enough. So you have a much shorter list of people where you're actually paying attention to and saying, oh my gosh, it's been a month since I've seen this person. I need to send them a direct message that's like, we haven't talked in a while. Can we jump on a Zoom call and chat? Can we grab coffee? Let's do lunch or whatever it is, right? So some of it is that's probably my favorite one to do with people. Other times you can go back and look through your calendar and actually calculate the amount of time. So instead of an interval of time, it's the amount of time. It all sort of varies in what works well with you. I find shortlist, longlist works best with most people.
So that was going to be something that I was going to ask you in terms of how do you, when you know so many people, how do you keep track of who you're speaking to, who you haven't spoken to in a long time? I guess if someone's trying to take this to a professional, more serious level, is in terms of that person's interests or what their birthday is and things of that nature. I don't know how far you actually take it, but if you do, it'd be good to shed some light on that.
Yeah, so in my opinion, and there's a bunch of people in this space that I think are great in terms of understanding information about people, getting to know the whole person. Like my buddy Jason Gaynard is brilliant at this. I kind of try and keep it simple into what can be tracked. And so I look at strength of relationship as the interval of time between when you interact with someone, because there's a pretty solid correlation, right? Yes, there is that friend from college who is your best friend and you could pick up the phone after 18 months and it feel like no time would pass. Those people are pretty rare though. Most of the time, your closest relationships, right? Your spouse or partner, your best friends, you're going to talk to them fairly frequently. I talk to my wife every day. I talk to my kids every day. I talk to my parents at least once a week, right? I talk to the coworkers that I care more about, don't tell them, at least every week, et cetera, right? So you do that as interval of time. Now you can manage that system where you can actually like keep a spreadsheet of it. There's software that actually kind of helps with this. So there's a piece of software called Contactually, which is really great because it monitors your email and some social media. There's another one called Levitate, which is an awesome one. And all of them, the goal is just to flag that person when too long a period of time has passed. So you tell the system, how long has it been since I've talked to that person? In my opinion, though, that's a bad place to start. One, because it is just crazy overwhelming to get set up if you think about 300, 400 people, right? But two, like, you probably don't know how long it's been until you've talked to some people, right? So what I tell people to do, if you want to do it this way on a regular basis, play like smartphone roulette, right? So like pull up your contacts list and just scroll through and pick a name, or go on like Facebook or LinkedIn. Most of those services, both, if you go to your connections, they're usually sorted by the frequency of interaction. So the people you talk with most are at the top. So go to the bottom, right? And look at who those people are. And start getting in a habit of like reaching out to one of them a week, et cetera. And that'll sort of start you down this path where eventually, as you can get your head around all of it, you might find that a system works better. But I would much rather people start with that small win and little thing to do, this regular habit of once a week, I'm going to reach out to someone I haven't talked to in 90 days plus. That is a small thing you can do with a huge ROI that I think is a way better place to start than these big complex systems, which are great, but let's work our way there.
Get the momentum going first. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
If you've never done it before, then it's definitely overwhelming when you're trying to build up such a big group of people in your network. So yeah, I mean, have you got any stories that you can share of your own that you've gone in your journey, basically, where you've realized that actually this introduction or knowing this person or making the effort to keep in touch with this person has actually helped me?
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of times networks work in mysterious ways, right? Not in mysterious ways like, boom, there was this person they introduced it, but like efforts compound, and it's not for 2 or 3 years later that it's all that helpful. Probably one of my favorite examples is the relationship that I've developed over probably the last 3 years plus with a buddy of mine, fellow podcaster, Jordan Harbinger, right? So Jordan and I sort of knew each other, kind of, sort of, but we started, and he'd been attending it much longer than me. We started attending this conference that we go to every single year. That sort of started our relationship because of lots of different people who already went there who were mutual friends, right? Now that didn't suddenly turn into like, oh, Jordan, I have $1 million business idea for you, or you to me, et cetera. But gradually we started bouncing ideas off of each other because essentially he was a famous podcaster. I was a failed podcaster. He was interested in writing. I was actually pretty good at that part, right? And then as he went through his transition where he basically had a falling out with his business partners and needed to sort of restart, we had that relationship in place to sort of guide it all through, and had enough mutual friends between the two of us where, I mean, literally in Jordan's case, when that falling out happened, we both basically went through our Rolodexes and called everybody we knew that had a YouTube channel, a podcast, like a blog, anything popular, to say like, can Jordan come on your show in the next 6 months, right? Why? Well, because he has to rebuild his show from scratch. And the only way he's going to do that is massive exposure to lots of different people. And so that sort of combination, and I'm not the only person that did this because Jordan's pretty savvy, right? But a lot of us were that way. And it's one of those things where it wasn't a, oh, I met you at this thing and it immediately turned into this amazing referral. It almost never works like that. It's usually slower and longer over time. And I think that's where a lot of people, frankly, frustrations with networking happens, is we go to like that one conference and we meet a bunch of people, but none of them hand us a check for $10,000. And so we go, oh, that was a waste. Networking doesn't work. It does, but you've got to let it compound over time.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I was speaking to a few other people and they had a similar sort of experience where you'd come in touch with someone, and after that first interaction, if they don't feel that they're getting anything out of it, they'll just move on to the next person. And
we've all been there, right? Like, I mean, I label this, like I label it name badging sometimes. Like when you're at that conference, and if you're watching this, right, this is a name badge. We're at that conference that we're talking, and gradually their eyes go down and they're reading your name and they're reading your company. And then when their eyes come up, they don't come back to you, they come over here because they've read your name and your company and they've decided that you're not worth it anymore. So who else is in this room, right? We've all been on the receiving end of that. Some of us have even done it kind of unintentionally. And it's a terrible mentality because you just don't know where things are going to go. It's literally in network science, it's called the problem of search in social networks. None of us, when we're looking at all these myriad of connections and then the way that people are 1 or 2 introductions away from us, no human has the mental capacity to chart the path that fate is going to take in getting us connected to stuff, right? Humans are bad searchers when it comes to looking through sort of that social network. So the only appropriate posture to have is one of openness, right? I think openness and deliberancy towards diverse connections, but that openness thing, if you're just looking for who's going to be immediately valuable to you, you are losing out on a wealth of opportunity 2, 3, 10 years down the road because you're not open, which is the only way to solve search in social networks.
Yeah, 100%. Because you don't realize that the person that you're trying to meet, even though they might not be directly beneficial to you at that very moment, you don't know who they know and who their friend's friend is. As you said, they have a massive influence on you, and you're only a few introductions away. So you never know how much of a relationship you can build, just like you and Jordan did, where you can just freely at that point reach out to everyone, without wanting much in return as a friend and help him out. So anyone could be in that situation if they were putting in the effort by the 2 or 3 year point. But no one really lasts that long unless they actually take the time and effort to do that. But the other thing I want to say as well is you said that you don't know how a network works. Sometimes it can work in unexpected ways. And I went to an event last year. Have you heard of Thrive?
Yeah.
So I was there last year, and I met someone for the first time who was his company basically did basically contributions to Forbes and all of these other type of big publishing websites, basically like Huffington Post, etc. And he had a lot of contributors on there, like Gary Vee, Grant Cardone, etc., etc. Now he was trying to get Dana White as one of his contributors. That's something that in the conversation he told me, and I was listening. And it just so happened I'd spoken to a 17-year-old 10 minutes before who went to school with Dana's son, and he's at his house all the time. And he had Dana as one of his first podcast guests because obviously it's his friend's dad. So I just turned around and said to the 17-year-old, hey, you need to meet this guy. He can help you get your name out there because he has a publishing business. And obviously he wants to meet Dana. So it's just like, if you listen and take the time to understand what the person wants, you can help them out. And in the future, they're going to remember you for that and then return the favor if you need it, you know?
Well, and I want to zero in on something that you did instinctually, because it's something that I think most people don't do when they're name badging people, right? And that is that the likelihood that they can help you in the immediate is very, very small. But also the likelihood that you can help them is very small as well. So some people approach, right, networking with, yeah, I want to give, I want to put it in the network, that's great. And these are the people that drive you nuts with the how can I help you question. And you're like, we met 2 minutes ago, and I have no idea if any of what you said is actually true. Like, let me Google you first, figure out if you're actually what you just said you are and not a serial killer, right? But I have no way of answering that question. So I love that you came from a position of giving, but it's not all that helpful. So a better thing to do, rather than being that person who is saying, how can I help you? The better way to approach it is when you're talking to someone, as you're listening to what they're struggling with or what their challenge, what they're going for, is do exactly what you did, which is go through your mental Rolodex and go, who do I know that can actually help this person? Because it's very unlikely it's going to be you, right? But it's very likely that you have somebody back here that would at least be beneficial for a 15-minute conversation, like you literally did. I mean, you could do it in one room because of an event like Thrive can let that happen, but we can do this in any situation. You could be in a situation 6 months from now where you're talking to somebody about publishing and how you land a New York City publisher. And I mean, have you published like a book? You probably haven't, right? If you haven't, like, what should you do? You should go, oh, well, I know Dave. Dave's published 3 with 3 different, like he knows this world pretty well. Let me introduce you to this person. That's a way better thing to offer most people than what is in your knowledge, skills, and abilities, but also like, because they don't even know if what you're saying you're an expert at is true at that point. It's just not likely you can help them. But back here, your network definitely can help them. And so that's a better thing to be a giver about. Now, a word here, obviously you're going to want a double opt-in introduction. Like, you're going to want to then go and ask that person, can I introduce you to this other person because I think you'd be beneficial? You're going to do all of that stuff to be polite. But again, it's a way better mentality to have when you're meeting new people, which is who do I know that can help this person? Because the chances that it's me is very small.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think the point that you make there, just what I was thinking about as you were speaking was all of these mistakes that you're bringing up that people do. I think it's because they're overcomplicated. Like, they really want to try hard, but you don't need to do that. You just need to go with the flow and be genuine and authentic. And I think you've used those words before.
Yeah, and again, all of these this is not advice. This is not, I did this and built a massive network and so you should too. And that's another problem, right? Is that a lot of people are just trying to do what Dale Carnegie said to do, or what Keith Ferrazzi said to do, and there's nothing against any of those people. There's only 2 of them, but nothing against any of the people that have written those advice books, but recognize that it's very unlikely that advice is going to be applicable to you in the moment. It's better to go, here's the phenomenon we're observing. How can I do it in a way that's authentic to me?
Yeah, no, definitely. And before we get into, I guess, the last few questions, I wanted to ask you a bit about, if you do go into a conference or a meeting or a place where there's going to be people outside of your regular network, how do you then approach okay, we're back.
Yeah, sorry, the Zoom gods hated us there right at the end.
Okay, yeah, cool, that's fine. What was the last bit that you heard?
Oh, no. that, again, that advice applicability thing blocks people from being authentic to.
So from everything that you're saying, what I was thinking about as you were speaking is that I think people try and overcomplicate it too much. It's just about being genuine and authentic when you're interacting with someone. And I've heard you use those words before.
Yeah, and again, that's why we start from a place of network science, because it allows you to go, here's the phenomenon at work. Now, how do I phrase it and express it in a way that I'm comfortable with? Where on the advice side, we end up going, well, this is what Dale Carnegie said to do. This is what Keith Ferrazzi said to do. And those two guys are great. And so is everybody else that's written a networking advice book, but they're not you. So you're running up against all of that mental work of trying to either make it authentic, or the feeling of trying to do something that's not authentic to you. It's way better to start from this, here is the phenomenon at work, just that percentages of helpfulness, you versus your network thing. That's not something somebody did. That's in the research, the problem of search and social networks. Now you express it in a way that's authentic to you. It's going to go a lot better.
So then once you're in that room and you know all of this stuff, you've kept it at the back of your mind, how do you then go about approaching a conversation without making it awkward and without doing the standard thing about, what do you do for work and making it a work type situation, which it always ends up being?
Yeah, and it's great that you said it always ends up being, because that's fine, right? You're going to talk about work probably in some capacity. It's a fair question. Most of us devote a significant amount of our waking hours to work, so it's fine to talk about it. What you want to make sure of is that you're talking about other things as well. The humans are sort of multifaceted. We have lots of different interests, and you want to uncover them. In network science terms, we call this multiplexity. The number of contexts for connection that you have with an individual affects the strength of your connection to them. In sociology, sometimes it's called having an uncommon commonality. What do I and V have in common that everybody watching this probably doesn't have? We're going to build a deeper relationship based on that uncommon commonality, and you want to be looking for those. And so I think there's little things here that you can do to explore that from the fringes. So rather than saying, what do, you can say, what are you excited about, or what are you looking forward to? The person can answer that in a work context, or they could answer it in something else. You can ask directly about hobbies and interests and things like that. You can ask about family or past history. Where did you grow up, etc. Tell me your story. Candidly, my favorite question to throw people for a loop when we're in the midst of a conversation is actually, who's your favorite superhero? For a variety of reasons, largely thanks to the success of Marvel movies, everyone has a favorite superhero. And if they don't, it's because they hate superheroes. But in either case, there's a story, so you can follow up with why, and you can get them to tell a story that's much more about them than it is the superhero. And now you're exploring them from a different context than just who they are and what they do. So again, whichever one is authentic to you, the point is to ask questions that are more open than just work, that allow people to answer it in a variety of different ways and see where that conversation goes. And don't feel like you're being wasteful in the conversation if you're not talking about work, because in reality, you're increasing the likelihood you're going to find that uncommon commonality.
Yeah, no, definitely. So just to wrap up before the last couple of questions, if you were to break down 3 things for people to start doing right now that they could go away doing after listening or watching this to grow their network, what would it be?
Okay, how about 2?
Go for it. 2 is fine.
2 habits, right? Habit number 1, get in the habit of reaching back out to a dormant tie, a person you haven't talked to in 90 days plus. Get in the habit of reaching out to one every single week. Habit number 2, adopt that habit when you're talking to people. Even your friends in close contacts that you currently know, stop trying to give them advice from your perspective and start thinking about who you know that would be better suited to give them advice. And what that'll do is that'll start putting that habit in your mind. And then when you're meeting total strangers, you'll be in that habit so you can do that. You know both of these habits will work because we talked about them in the past. So those are the 2 in terms of small changes to your behavior, but big ROI. Those are probably the 2 biggest ones.
Well, that's interesting, actually, because the second one is something that I've never thought of, or maybe subconsciously, but never consciously made the effort to do that. So you did that,
thrive, right? Now we just need to do it.
Fair enough. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. Exactly. So now it makes sense. So with the last few questions, then, if you had a microphone and the whole world could hear you, what would be the message you'd share?
Oh man, I don't know that anything I would have to say is you know what, so I'll tell you what, it's not actually my message, right? I was talking to somebody today about something totally unrelated, And at one point I answered him with the question of, he was talking about, yeah, but what about this? And what about this? And what about this? And I answered him with the question of, you know what? Stories aren't science. And then I quoted him, someone from an intellectual hero of mine named W. Edwards Deming, who in management circles is like a god. You have to be a management nerd to know who he is, so don't worry about it. But he had this great phrase when it came to making decisions. And the phrase was, in God we trust, all others bring data. Right? And I think so often we don't do that. A compelling emotional story or art, that phrase art, right? We'll make decisions based off sort of just that. Maybe go look for some data first to justify whether or not you're making that right decision. It's really cool to have emotion and to have them steer you in a certain way, but you need data, and odds are there's some research in some capacity that will help you. I spent my whole career trying to translate that research and get it out of the ivory tower and into the office where people are doing work. And that would be my encouragement to most people, is look for it too before you make that decision.
That's interesting. Yeah, definitely. So the second question is, what are you most passionate these days?
Question based on everything. I mean, unquestionably, what I'm most passionate about, I have a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I'm trying to help boys, and I'm turning them into men, right? That's what I'm by far the most passionate about. That has nothing to do with my professional career, at least not yet. What am I most passionate about in terms of a professional realm is, again, really trying to get the science into practice idea. In fact, I even use those phrases at the end of every chapter in Friend of a Friend. It's going from science to practice. There's a wealth of really awesome research out there that can guide decisions on who we spend our time with, how we spend our money, what jobs we take, all of that sort of stuff. And I really, I love explaining certain phenomena to people and seeing that light bulb moment, or the eyes moment where their eyes light up because they get it. That's really, really exciting. So in a professional context, that's what I live for.
I love that. Yeah. So just for people who might have missed it, the first thing you said, because the audio was crackling a little bit, I think you said the most thing that you're passionate about personally is helping your boys turn into men. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Perfect. And the last question.
You asked open-ended questions, so now we're talking about family life, right? We wouldn't have been there if you stayed in work context. So proof of concept right there.
That's true. Very true. Yeah. But again, see, that was done naturally. So don't try and overthink it. Just go with it.
Right. Totally.
So the last question is, with when all is said and done, obviously you've done a lot of work so far. You've gone on a bit of a journey. You've learned a lot along the way, and I'm sure you've got many more ideas in the pipeline. What is it that you see your legacy being, if you do have a concept of what you'd like it to be eventually?
Yeah. So again, those two boys and turning to men and having a good opinion of me and arriving at 18 years old without having been jailed and that kind of stuff, that's way more important to me. But if we're talking about it in a professional context, I hope that when people look at whether it's a tiny little video like in the Daily Burk, or they've read an entire book, or they've read all of my books, or whatever, I hope that people see how it helped them work smarter. It's a term we use a lot of times. And, we always say work smarter, not harder. I think that's a false dichotomy, because I think if you're going to be a hard worker, you have to work smarter. And I hope that a lot of my insights have helped people do that and then tap into the best work they were ever capable of doing.
I love that. Yeah. Well, you're already on your way to doing that with everything that you've done so far. And I'm sure you're going to be, releasing much more work and thought behind all of those ideas. So thank you so much for taking the time to share your journey and your wisdom. What's the best place for people to find out more about you, your books, and future work?
Yeah, I mean, the best place if you're watching this is the show notes for this, right? So down here, if you're watching, if you're listening, whatever you can do to access show notes on a podcast player, because it varies by every. So that's probably the best. He's going to take care of you if you're watching. So go to that. He's going to have links to all of that. If you type David Burkus, Burkus into Google, the only one with an online presence, so you will find me. But a better go is just right below whatever you're watching this on, because it's all going to be there.
Yeah, most definitely. I will link to everything that we talked about, all of the resources, plus your social media and your website as well. So no, thank you again. And I definitely look forward to talking to you about your next project, whatever that might be.
Yeah, thank you again. Thank you so much for having me.